So, are we all good to go? Fantastic. Well, then, without further ado, I am really thrilled to introduce Dr. Linda Yueh, a fellow in economics at St Edmund Hall, Oxford University, and adjunct professor of economics at London Business School, a broadcaster, a writer, and of course, the author of The Great Economists, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today. And my goodness, we need their ideas today because things are not going well, but we'll start with an extract. So if you could go ahead, that would be fantastic.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And can I firstly say thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you all for being here this evening. And I love the name of the club, the Trouble Club. It reminds me of the former Congressman John Lewis.
Oh yes.
And he used to say, "Yeah, you got to get up to some good trouble in your life."
Nothing makes us happier than when people arrive at venues like this and they go up to the bar and they say, "Hi, I'm looking for trouble." It just fills us with so much joy.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. So I'm just going to read a short passage from my book, and I'm just gonna start. I was about to say something about recessions and crashes, but it'll be obvious. In October 1929, just 9 days before the Great Crash, the American economist Irving Fisher infamously declared that stocks had reached a, quote, permanently high plateau. But 3 days later, on the 24th of October, commonly known as Black Thursday, the market dropped. This was just the precursor to a larger fall. The following week, on 29th of October, what became known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed disastrously. Over those few days, the stock market lost a quarter of its value. That night, Fisher told the shell-shocked audience of the National Association of Credit Men that he believed nothing fundamental had changed, and they should ride out the temporary storm in the markets. He said, quote, "The trough was close, and the ensuing rally will see the markets quickly return to previous highs." But, as we know, Fisher was wrong. The Great Crash became the Great Depression, and the resulting plunge in the markets wiped out his own $10 million fortune. Ever the optimist, or just out of sheer desperation, he continued to predict a recovery in stock markets and the US economy. However, neither would happen during the rest of the 1930s. Fisher's loss was not just financial. His reputation suffered irreparable damage, and he found himself marginalized by businessmen and politicians. Few were willing to take seriously somebody who had been so publicly and spectacularly proven wrong and lost almost everything as a result. Fisher had marked himself out as a loser. History, though, has been much kinder and recognized Fisher's huge contribution to economics. Economics Nobel laureate Joseph Schumpeter described him as, quote, "the greatest economist that America has produced." Indeed, a great deal of modern-day economics can be traced back to his work. He was the first American economist of any standing. In the late 19th century, the US had few economic thinkers. This was largely because the US government intervened little in the economy, so economics had a limited role in policy. Fisher's work marked a turning point where the headquarters of academic economics moved from Europe to the US, and in doing so, firmly aligned economics with mathematics and statistics. In 1930, he was the co-founder and first president of the Econometric Society, which developed the quantitative aspects of economics. Nearly every Nobel laureate in economic sciences has been a member. It is remarkable just how much of modern economics taught in university programs today was established by Irving Fisher. Yet, he is seldom included in books such as this one, or considered by those studying the history of economic thought. This might have been because he never combined his ideas into a unified theory of economics, in comparison to, say, John Maynard Keynes's general theory, which rather stole his limelight. He also had few disciples, working predominantly on his own and rarely supervising graduate students. Or it might be because he predicted the stock market in 1929 was at a permanently high plateau. But he is included in my book, The Great Economists, And a lot of his theories ended up helping us avoid the worst, a repeat after the banking crash from a decade ago. Because his theory of debt deflation was drafted while he was waiting for the stock market to recover throughout the 1930s. And that was the lesson learned from Ben Bernanke, who was a scholar of the Great Depression and studied the work of Irving Fisher. So instead of reading through the rest of the pages, I'll just tell you what happened to him. So Irving Fisher, he so believed that the stock market was about to recover that he borrowed money from his sister-in-law. So you see, Irving Fisher had the misfortune of marrying rich. Stay with me, stay with me. So his wife came from a patrician, well-to-do New England family. So her family's money paid for their house in New Haven. He was a professor at Yale University, paid for their servants, paid for essentially everything. So he thought he needed to make his own money. He actually invented the Rolodex. Do you remember the Rolodex? Remember, I predominantly teach students who are born in the 21st century. So I have to describe what a Rolodex is. Thank goodness some of you know what it is. He invented the Rolodex. He was actually fairly wealthy. But as you know, to get really rich, you have to bet it on the stock market. It's like Warren Buffett says, you can never be rich unless you can make money while you're sleeping. And so he put his money in the stock market. And then when he lost everything, he borrowed from his sister-in-law to try and get it all back. So you know how this story is going to go. So he remained indebted to his sister-in-law throughout the rest of her life until she died. And then he couldn't afford his house in New Haven. So then Yale University leased it back to him and let him rent it. And then he couldn't afford the rent. So then he and his wife moved into a small flat. And then his wife died. And then he died. And he's been largely forgotten in history. But it's okay because history is now kinder to him. He's included in books like this for his achievements. That was not a great story, actually.
No, but it's a cautionary tale, which is also very important. And Irving Fisher certainly, his theories would be incredibly important today as we approach a very difficult financial time. And to kind of come back to the present day and what we're dealing with in this very moment, I believe we have the autumn budget coming up on the 17th of November. What are we looking at? What can we expect from that budget? And are there any particular theories from any of these economists that you think will be making a real showing?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Great question.
We've trapped the microphone. Hang on, there we go. We're fine.
Okay. Everyone has a glass of wine, right? So what did Jeremy Hunt, the chancellor, say at the weekend? He said, I've got the worst job in the world, except for Matt Hancock in the jungle. And I thought, well, that's going to be encouraging for Thursday. I mean, in a sense, that's what we are expecting, I'm afraid, on Thursday. He's also said he can't pull any rabbits out of the hat. I think on Thursday, what we're going to find is the government is going to struggle to balance the books over the immediate term. So he's going to probably spread it out over about 5 years. And there are actually lessons from history, specifically, as you say, from John Maynard Keynes. So John Maynard Keynes made his name in the 1930s during the Great Depression. His main insight was that there's a lot of this going on in economics. The neoclassical economists were all wrong because they said, oh, don't worry about it. Recession, booms and busts. It just, the economy will right itself. And he famously said, well, it will do in the long run, but in the long run, we're all dead. So he pioneered the theory that government needs to intervene to support demand during the Great Depression. That actually helped right the economy during the 1930s. So I think it's that insight, which I hope to see on Thursday, which is, yes, there's a huge black hole in order to get debt falling as a share of GDP, probably over a 5-year horizon, which is the forecasting period of the OBR. But to do that, you would not reduce demand during a recession. And we are probably currently in a recession. I say probably because it's being forecasted as such. And, the great economy, J.K. Galbraith said, economic forecasting exists to make astrology look respectable. So, as people will be struggling with the cost of living crisis, I'm hoping to see over this 5-year horizon that the measures that will cut spending and raise taxes to stabilize the debt level will occur in the back half of this forecasting period, because most recessions, by the way, last about 9 months on average. So the UK is forecast to have a long recession, but it could be wrong. But fiscal policy can both shorten and soften the recession by supporting people who most need it and making sure you're not cutting back on public demand at a time when private demand is struggling. So his mix of tax rises and spending cuts, it is sure the scale, but it's the timing that I think is probably the main lesson to learn from John Maynard Keynes. Now, the next bit I'm going to say to you is going to make all of you really worried. So Keynesianism, just dominated economics until the 1970s. Because 1970s, the monetarists came to the forefront, people like Milton Friedman, because the 1970s was characterized by stagflation, which is very unusual, high inflation and a stagnating economy. Because normally, if inflation is high, the economy is booming and unemployment is low. You don't normally get inflation is high, unemployment is high. So right now, thankfully, unemployment is low. But 1970s inflation was high because of 2 oil price shocks in the Middle East. And we currently also have an oil price shock that stems from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the reason why Keynesianism fell out of favor is because it could not explain how you write an economy in a high inflationary environment. The monetarists who focused on monetary policy and money supply could. So I hope the other lesson to be learned history. This is actually from Mark Twain. This is not from an economist at all. He said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So make sure you take the right histories, but do not apply it indiscriminately because the current circumstances are different than what you had from before. So hopefully on Thursday, the right lessons will be picked up from history.
Fingers crossed. That's a great quote from Mark Twain, I think. Definitely going to bank that one. And how does this budget that we're probably about to see come Thursday differ from what Liz Truss was trying to do? And for those of us who saw the pound crash and the markets fall, what caused that? Give us kind of the context to that.
So let's see. Are there any similarities between this budget and Liz Truss's mini budget? I think the one similarity which I do hope to see is a focus on economic growth. So this is actually a lesson not just for economies, but also for companies. So in my book, I write, there is a chapter on creative destruction, which is actually about how companies come through and drive, booms and what causes them to go bust. And one of the lessons is actually companies that invest appropriately while keeping a close eye on costs and their bottom line can actually thrive in coming out of a recession. And I think a similar principle goes for governments in that if you're going to support demand, do it in a smart way. Do it in a way that actually boosts equality, grings the economy, invests in people. If you're going to spend, do it strategically. Do it in a way that actually matches your medium-term targets. So yes, there's some immediate help that needs to be had. But if you want to think about how you can get greater returns, then that's actually the growth focus, which I do also hope that you've nicely drawn out that we can see on Thursday. So the economic thinking behind this is we talk about debt. There's always like billions of pounds. There's always billions of pounds, which is really quite worrying. But actually what economists and markets most look for is the debt to GDP ratio. So it's the amount of debt as a share of your national output. So there's been a lot of focus on debt. But if GDP, the denominator, gets larger and you can grow the economy, then you can stabilize the debt ratio much faster than if you do austerity too stringently and then you end up shrinking GDP. And then no matter how much you cut, you could just end up with a higher debt to GDP ratio because the economy is shrinking. The worst case of this was Greece during the Euro crisis, where more and more austerity just led to the economy shrinking, and there was no way to stabilize that debt level. So coming back to, oh, of course.
Oh, sorry, no, we'll do questions at the end. But yeah, don't worry, we'll come to them. So just keep it in mind.
Sorry, I was going to say yes, but I'm very agreeable. So
otherwise, it'll just be questions for the rest of the evening.
So I think where the mini budget under the Liz Truss government didn't work was that if you cannot explain how you fund these measures to boost growth and how they boost growth, then you don't instill confidence that you will get over a 3 or 5 year period, because it does require a degree of trust when governments tell you that this is how we'll get it to stabilize over the next few years. You need to explain the how. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons why markets lost confidence. And yes, sterling crashed. Sterling hit, nearly hit parity, $1.03. I wrote an op-ed for the FT literally a few days before, and the big topic was, oh dear, sterling's at $1.13, 15% down this year. What explains it? Oh wow! And then like the mini budget, and I was like, do I need to revise this article? This is and so that sell-off is a reflection of pulling money out. So currencies fall for lots of reasons, for trading, but also for investment. And then I think the worst reaction was in bond markets, because gilt yields jumped. So again, the expectation is, you remember what I just said about John Maynard Keynes not being able to help in the 1970s. His theories is that deficit spending, if you borrow to spend, is inflationary. And so you have to do it very carefully. So the minute that they think inflation is going to go up as a result of the mini budget, then whatever I'm lending to the UK, I will get paid back less. So therefore, I'm going to ask for higher interest rate yield in order to lend to the UK. And that's what contributed to the spike in borrowing costs, which are already going up because we saw interest rates going up. But the spike was because of concern that there's going to be inflation, which will be around for longer, and I want more to lend to the UK. And that's why mortgage rates, just jumped. And they began to come down when there was a rapid change in government. And then you could see the yields kind of hovering back towards about 4%. So that's the reaction. It's credibility, it's confidence. It's just explaining, how what you're doing. And that's probably the main thing we'll look for on Thursday, which is, can they and one of the advantages of Rishi Sunak being PM is that he was the chancellor, and he did actually, keep confidence going as he borrowed a lot during the pandemic lockdown.
Absolutely. And I do want to get on to the quantitative easing that we did during COVID. But to kind of take things back to the beginning, you start in obviously the most clear place that you would start a book about the Great Economists with Adam Smith, an economist who many of us will be familiar with, or if you're not, you might have heard of, the invisible hand or some of the terms that he came out with. So give us a little overview about him and what his thinking might be useful for today.
Yeah, great. So Adam Smith is known as the father of economics. His book, The Wealth of Nations, is the seminal text that many. I know I'm missing the mic.
We want to switch. You take mine.
No, you know what it is. I think it's because I'm just going to go.
It's okay. If you get tied up or you trip over, then we'll. Yeah, just be careful getting up later on.
Adam Smith, he was actually writing as part of the Age of Enlightenment. And so this was a real push towards rationalism. And you could kind of, okay, now you might think, how did he end up as an economist then? Okay, but he was a philosopher, actually. Economics didn't really exist as a subject. But what he observed was that England was the first industrialized nation. What he saw was this complete shift from an agrarian society into a new way of organizing production. And so Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations could see that prosperity was increasing in England. And that's what prompted him to write a theory around how that might happen. I think what's extraordinary is actually how many of his insights still hold today. The invisible hand that you mentioned, that is about having supply and demand, rather than say, government decide how much to produce and how much you should consume. And I think that process is fascinating. Adam Smith was also himself, like many of these great economists, just interesting, fascinating people. So he lived with his mother for his whole life. He went down to he's Scottish. He went down to Oxford as a visiting student, looked around, decided that the Oxford Dons had no intention of teaching, and then just taught himself while he was there. I try not to say that when I'm actually at my university. And then what's fascinating was he did a tour. He was the tutor for the son of a chancellor of the exchequer. So he went to the continent, and he, I think all of that then culminated in him writing down what he thought could explain this industrialization process. So he spent 10 years writing The Wealth of Nations. He chose to publish it in 1776, which is a really memorable date for Americans. And probably quite memorable if you watch Hamilton and you hear that song with King George. And the reason he published it then was that he wanted to influence the British attitude towards what the Americans call the War of Independence, because he felt, based on his theories, that the UK could trade profitably with the American colonies, regardless if they were colonies or not, and to stop the ruinous war. That the money that was spent in trying to prevent America from becoming independent. So I think it was that ability, that intent to influence the major events is a trait that all the great economists share. They could both be very technical and very specialized, but they wanted to make an impact on the world. But like a lot of great economists, like I said, he actually lived with his mother. He moved in with her, and he was an eccentric. He used to bang his head against the wall to get his thinking in order. He used to walk down the street mumbling to himself, which a lot of people thought he was a madman until they realized he was Professor Adam Smith. And then after, when he was towards the end of his life, he decided that none of his work was worth anything, and he wanted all of his manuscripts burned. But thankfully that did not happen. And he's made this massive impact on economics as a science. In his time, it was called political economy, of course.
And while the economy has changed drastically, and it's so interesting because probably the biggest way it's changed is that he was looking at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Manufacturing was becoming the boom that, in the United Kingdom, that's what was booming. And today there is this kind of push again to go back to manufacturing, even though our country today is a predominantly service-based economy. But, suddenly in about 2012, all our politicians suddenly had hard hats on and high-vis jackets, and they were all determined that we were going to build our way or become a huge manufacturing hub. So why is this pushback to manufacturing? Why is it that that Adam Smith didn't approve of the service industry, didn't consider it to be proper economics? And why is it that our leaders are so keen for us to go back to becoming manufacturing powerhouses?
Yeah, it's a great question. I should have said the book is organized around great economists, but every chapter is around one of our current economic problems and what ideas could help us with it. And the first chapter is Adam Smith, and the title of the chapter is "Should We Rebalance the Economy?" And this picks up exactly this point, which is, so Adam Smith thought that services was a pretty useless pursuit. He imagined it to be the province of opera singers, and it's because in his day, and this is still a conception I think that has carried through, is that services is intangible. So I don't think he could have ever imagined that an opera singer could end up producing. You do remember CDs, right? I was looking for something tangible. The problem with digital downloads is that we're back into the intangible, and then be able to sell the CDs and those records. And so it makes commercialization possible. In his day, services was just viewed with a degree of frivolity. And I think that's a problem that still holds today. So if you look at the way that we measure output, manufacturing is measured very closely. So it gives policymakers something concrete to hang on to. Of course, after the banking crash from 10 years ago, financial services, I know bankers who pretend that they're like teachers and they go to cocktail parties, but so there is this, so that also colors, why don't we go back to making more things rather than, being a services economy. And this idea that services could be productive is hard to back up with evidence in the way that you can produce how many widgets. And I think that's what makes it also harder for policymakers to say, I've done X, which has, promoted services. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I'm going to assume that probably all of you work in the services sector. Okay, so show of hands. How many of you have been in meetings that have been utterly boring and all you have been doing is doing your grocery list in your head? Now, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, I want to know what you do for a living, and I'm going to join you. And how many of you, raise your hands, have been in meetings where you have this great breakthrough and you've moved something forward and come to a decision? Oh, please raise your hand. So in terms of national output, those two meetings are the same, because the measure is not of quality, it's just, your time. So how do you measure productivity in services? And that intangible economy just makes it harder to invest in it. It makes it harder for I think policymakers to really embrace it. But I think there have been a number of changes. One of the biggest changes, I would say, is called the servicification of manufacturing. So a lot of the manufacturing, especially in this country that we do, has a high degree of embedded value from services. In fact, half of our manufactured exports, the value added is from services, from the R&D, from the marketing, from the branding, from the innovative ways in which a product is actually produced. Now, I think recognizing that can help us kind of move away from almost romanticizing, manufacturing, which, yes, some segments of manufacturing, and hopefully will help promote services a bit more, because that is actually, 80% of the economy and, the majority of employment in this country. So yes, so Adam Smith wasn't keen on services, but that's because of the way that services was done in his day. I like to think that, when we answer the question, should we rebalance the economy, that he would see the value added now in services and think, actually, this is the market, working pretty well.
And we can't really blame him for not anticipating the internet, I suppose, can we? Probably where the most services takes place. But what's really interesting as well is that, you would assume that manufacturing is China's best, kind of strongest part of the economy, but actually China's predominantly service industry today. And it was so interesting to read about, obviously, Karl Marx, which is the interesting chapter, can a communist nation ever become wealthy? And China is the China paradox. Why is it that China has become such a successful economy, despite having a lot of these Marxist principles, kind of Marx through Mao, I suppose? So give us a little bit of an oversight on that.
Yeah, so firstly on Karl Marx. So Karl Marx, his wife was actually, he's German, he was actually married to an aristocrat. His wife was, Bond something or another, and he actually wanted, they wanted their children to marry, appropriately. So when his daughter wanted to marry a trade unionist, you can begin to see the irony here, given the Communist Manifesto was actually written for a trade union Congress. He was opposed to the marriage. He didn't want her to marry a proletarian. Eventually, he agreed. And here's the biggest irony of the whole Marx story, which is, so Engels was actually his co-author, the least appreciated co-author in history. Engels used his family fortune to support Karl Marx, his aristocratic wife, and then his daughter and her husband, using the money from his family's factory in Manchester. The Engels family were capitalists. And he found out about the hardship of people working in factories from his mistress, who worked in a factory. By the way, not every chapter has salacious details like this, but there's quite a few. So coming back to Can a Communist Country Grow Rich? That chapter is called Can China Grow Rich? And the other thing I should say is, Marx never actually saw the success of not even the Soviet Union. He had passed away before the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. He certainly didn't see China become communist in 1949. But his argument was that capitalism exploits workers. Capitalism exploits workers. That means that there will be a crisis. And when there's a crisis, the workers will rise up, and then therefore there'll be a revolution. So that's essentially what happened. Yeah, it's not quite like that in any of the countries. But anyways, so China became communist. And I think the organizing principles around having the state having a role in the economy, that's where some of the complexities of economic growth come in, because it's focused on China, but there's other countries that had a great deal of state planning, especially in East Asia. So Japan became the world's second biggest economy, probably one of the biggest successful growth stories in the post-war period. They intervened in every aspect of the economy, and so it's that principle that I think is drawn out, that the role of the state has actually been pretty significant in quite a few countries that have managed to grow rich. But can China grow rich? I mean, you heard my quote about economic forecasting, right? One of China's challenges is, as it becomes more marketized, as in the market plays a greater role, the state allocating and directing, that's going to be harder. So China's always experimented. So it's allowed provinces to experiment, to see what works. And if it works, they roll it out nationally. If it doesn't work, they don't roll it out. But as the market becomes much more complicated and power becomes more centralized in current day China, will they still be able to do that process that seems to have worked in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and China is now the world's second biggest economy. And so that's the unknown. But I think the conclusion is there is a role for the state. It is going to be different in different countries. But the most important aspect of what determines growth in the end are actually good institutions. So can you have good institutions in a communist system or in a system that still purports to be communist? And a big part of that is equality. So, China's also quite unequal, and presently they're trying to make it more equal. So I think, in fact, China was so unequal at one point. It was communist China was more unequal than capitalist America. So to me, those are the kinds of, factors to look at about growth. It's not just labor, capital, and, technology. It is actually institutions, and equality. So yeah, that's, there's quite a lot of, I would say, nuances in a lot of how the thinking of these economists have changed over the years as well. But for Marx, there was no nuance. He believed in revolution.
He's a very interesting figure to read today. And is, what you say about great institutions, I think it's also Robert Solow who talked a lot about what makes countries particularly prosperous is their good institutions. But I want to come to the female economist in the book, the wonderful Joan Robinson, who was an interesting and also kind of a very Marxist figure in a lot of ways. But obviously what she focused on hugely was low wages and imperfect competition, because often economists project that there's going to be perfect competition in an economy, and then that's often not the case. And obviously this year is another year of strikes, so many different groups of people demanding higher wages and wages not keeping up with inflation. What do you think Joan would have made of it today?
Yeah, she's absolutely fascinating character. So Joan Robinson, in the span of the 1930s, went from a middling student to becoming one of the wrote the first textbook on Keynesianism. She was one of the 5 people at Cambridge who was entrusted by John Maynard Keynes to review the general theory, which is his seminal work. At the time, she was married to one other member of this inner circle, Cambridge Don. She was also having an affair with yet another member of this inner circle, who's also Cambridge Don. So I like to think she had a casting vote on the general theory, 3 out of 5 of the people. So Joan Robinson essentially took Keynesianism and applied it to the labor market. So a basic premise of Keynesianism is that markets are not perfect. I know, right? So obvious. But maybe we'll get to Keynes, but it completely revolutionized thinking. So her theory is called monopsony. So that's monopoly in the labor market. So we have imperfect competition, and you have power vested in a few companies. So they have monopoly power in the labor market. Then wages will be lower than they should be. Just like in monopolies, prices are higher than they should be. So monopsony is currently the theory that economists have turned to in recent years to try and understand, why are wages so low? Because that's actually the title of this chapter. Why are wages so low? Why is it that in the US, for instance, productivity has increased, but wages have not kept pace? Why is it that wages are so low in this country? It's low in Germany, it's low in Japan. And her theory helps to see the power of market dominance, and that's begun to inform some of our understanding of what makes wages so low. So some of the explanations are around bargaining power of workers. Some of the explanations are around the rise of temp workers, part-time workers who do not have job security. Some of the explanations, and again, it differs from countries, are around superstar firms. So one of the biggest determinants of how much you get paid if you are a janitor is whether or not you work for Apple or you work for your local, Tesco. And so these differences have to do with the dominance of Apple. And her theory, monopsony, helps us understand to look for what's creating the market power of these companies. And once you recognize it, then can you regulate to promote wages that keep up with productivity? So her theories are hugely important today as we grapple with, how is it that returns are so high to owners of capital, and yet labor don't seem to be getting, their, a share that reflects, how much they are producing. And I think so. Therefore, she's particularly, pertinent, I think, today. But yes. Later on life, she's the, I should have said, at the time she was doing economics, you could do exactly the same degree as a man, but you wouldn't be awarded a degree in economics. She studied at Cambridge. So it's very rare to have female economists. So she was unusual, and she became extremely prominent because of her theories around monopsony, but she never won the Nobel Prize in economics, the highest prize. And it could be lots of reasons for that. Could be sexism, could be that she turned against her own work later in her life. She denounced Keynesianism later on and decided that could not explain why some countries grow rich and most countries are poor. So she started giving her lectures in Cambridge wearing communist outfits from Vietnam, just as a peasant, because she became a supporter of Marxism. So I guess if you disavow your own body of work, that probably is not going to help you win the Nobel Prize.
Certainly not. I want to talk about, because you mention a lot, Japan is an example that you give often in the book, Japan's economic slowdown over the last couple of decades, especially due to its hugely aging population. And we're facing a very similar situation in this country. And I think it's Robert Solow who predicts the slowdown of economic growth. Is that what we're facing? And to what extent can things like automation help us, or will they hinder us in the long run?
Yeah, Japan is absolutely fascinating. So the Solow paradox, so Robert Solow, he is the creator of neoclassical growth models. The Solow paradox is his observation that you can see the computer age everywhere, except in the productivity data. So how is it we're surrounded by all this technology, and yet we seem to grow so slowly? And so one of the oh, and by the way, his observation about it in his own personal working life was that he said, Before my secretary had a computer, she worked for me, and now I work for her. So, do we face a slow growth future is the chapter title of that book. And Japan is about, we're actually slightly better than Germany and Italy, which are about 10 years away from Japan in terms of their demography, the number of the aging profile of the country. But essentially, Japan had a massive crash in the early 1990s. And even after they sorted out the banks and deleveraged, it turns out it was probably hiding an underlying problem, which is that the aging society was correlated with low productivity. And so one of the things that Japan has done, and also they're pretty anti-immigration, is that they have invested in robots. So have any of you been to Japan recently? There are restaurants where, robots, serve you. There's a robot called Pepper who's been discontinued, invested by SoftBank and produced by a French company. Pepper is a companion robot. So Pepper reads your emotions. Now, so when I mentioned Pepper on a panel once, the economist next to me goes, I don't see how Pepper being a companion robot increases productivity, but having one would probably help my marriage. The potential for automation to be labor augmenting as opposed to labor replacing could be the stage that we're at. Might have to be more the robot servers than Pepper, the companion robot. But this idea that you could enhance productivity as your workforce isn't growing as quickly or shrinking is actually something that Japan has looked at, and it's actually, I think, quite important for us all to take a look at. But the one thing I will say is, the older I get, the less I accept you're less productive as you get older. So, for instance, one of my colleagues, a couple of colleagues wrote a book called The 100-Year Life. The alternative title was The 60-Year Career, but they didn't think they would sell any books. So instead of living for, instead of working for 40 years and, living for 60 years, if you lived healthily until you're 100, you would work for 60 years. So if you were born in the 1970s, there's a 50% chance that you will live to 100 and be healthy. And so the demography we're describing for Japan was in the past few decades. Looking ahead, the longevity that we're lucky enough to enjoy in advanced economies is something to think about. I chaired their book talk, and actually the question they got asked the most was, okay, so if I work for 60 years and I live to 100, what's the optimal number of marriages? That's not a question the economist can answer. Actually, somebody's probably.
Yeah, I think an economist could probably have a good stab at that. Well, we're going to come to questions from the audience in just a second. If you're watching it, I'm sorry, I think that's the bathroom. So if you can all hear the flushing behind us, we're trying to get that fixed. We're just going to tell people to not go into the bathroom. Hopefully that will help. There are plenty in this large hotel, so I'm sure they'll find another one. But we're going to come to the Q&A section in just a second. But it's so interesting that this book came out in 2018 because this was the middle of Trump and it was a few years after Brexit. Brexit was still being negotiated at that point. So kind of give us, I suppose, from an economic point of view only, what were your thoughts on Trump after now that we've got kind of a few years of space between the end of his presidency?
Isn't he running again?
Oh, yeah. For now, we have space.
All right. Okay. Oh my God, how much time do we have? So I write about Trumpism in the epilogue, and I think that entire epilogue is a backlash against globalization. And so I think Trumpism probably represented lots of things. Oh, by the way, do you know there's actually a definition of Trumpism? The definition of Trumpism is a U.S. Politician who says outrageous things.
Is that in a dictionary somewhere?
I think so. Yeah. But I think, despite the lots of things which were said, I think he picked up a strain of backlash against globalization, and it sort of fueled the the desire to make America great again. It kind of fueled this, to be a great nation, we need to, and I think there's probably two main drivers of essentially the stagnant wages of blue collar workers, especially in the Rust Belt, which is what we call skill-based technical change. So as the economy moves into higher skilled manufacturing and services, you start to hollow out the kind of the blue collar, mid-skilled workers. And of course, that is related to globalization, because if you no longer produce those things, you would import those things. And so the two are always related. And I think what Trump tapped into was this feeling that trade is unfair and that there are losers from the way that the economy develops. And that both of those things are actually true. And I think that's where some of the adherence to that is important to understand. So the question is, what can you do about this backlash against globalization? I mean, if you know the cause, then then the remedy is more apparent. So if it's because that workers are losing out because of deindustrialization, then it is about helping those workers, not in a redistributive way after they've lost their jobs, but pre-distributive, as in help invest in people so they can adjust to whatever disruption is coming down the line. And secondly, if you know that we've known since the days of David Ricardo that trade creates losers. So you need to support people who will be negatively affected by trade. So if you enter into a free trade agreement or you allow things to come into your country, and that's going to cause an area, a region, a class of workers to no longer be as demanded, then again, pre-distribution, there needs to be investment in that area to create incentives for them to create new businesses. And that's actually the lesson from history, that whenever there's been disruption, such when there's been industrialization in the time of Adam Smith, new jobs get created. So there's not a finite number of jobs, but you have to have the conditions to unleash that entrepreneurship and support people who are affected. So to me, that's a lesson I hope we have learned from Trumpism, and that would help with this backlash against globalization, which is still with us. But, as you're listening to, you're probably thinking, so we've known that since the days of David Ricardo, who wrote his book in the 19th century. So Paul Samuelson, another great economist I quote in the book, was asked, if all you economists have known this, so why haven't you done anything about it? And his answer was, I can't think of a president who has been overburdened by knowledge of economics. The other problem I'm going to say is Harry Truman, the US president, who observed, just give me a one-handed economist. Economists are always saying on the one hand, on the other hand. But I think, to, a fair society, a society that recognizes, does distributional analysis of impact, I think all of that would go a long way to just, create address this backlash, but more importantly, I think create, a more equitable, society. So we'll see what happens.
We'll see. Trump 2024. Can't wait. We'll come to questions from the audience now. Of course, we had a desperate one. We think we do have a microphone. Although unfortunately, we do have to ask a woman first. That's kind of the rules at Trouble, unfortunately. So if any of the ladies in the room have a question, I'm sure many of you do. I know it's very terrifying going first, but if anyone wants to pop up their hand, yes, go for it. Yeah. And you get extra points because you're in the front row. So go for it.
Thank you, doubles. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I must admit, I haven't read your book yet, but I'll definitely pick it up tonight. I just wanted to get your view on the sort of sustainable green economy that's coming. Do you see that as the sort of the agriculture, the industrial revolution coming from the agriculture to industrial? Is that the sort of next stage in our economic growth in the advanced economies?
Yes, absolutely. It's, to me, sometimes it's been called the fourth industrial revolution, whatever is coming next. But I think if you look at when you go from agriculture to industry to services, We are now in the stage of, of being a services economy, and we're all experiencing growth, which is, probably partly measurement, but also partly, like I said, the Solow paradox. We don't seem to be able to increase our standards of living very much. Those are the points in history where you would expect, a turning point. And that is actually what 250 years of economic history has shown us. And so the green revolution, sustainable growth, the IMF recently did an assessment, would create 1% of GDP spent on green infrastructure would create 5 to 8 jobs versus in traditional infrastructure. So if you think about the sector as having low investment, so therefore every pound of investment gets greater returns because you haven't yet hit diminishing returns. And that's what I mean about high capital stock and then therefore diminishing returns. And you need kind of the next growth boost. I think that is the sector and that holds huge promise and could create, this better society that I was describing as I think a reflection of discontent with where we currently are, and move us into something which is more sustainable, greener, and could raise our standards of living. So, I would say there's been quite a lot of, and this is always there's been quite a lot of expectation of what could drive this turning point. Is it green innovations? Could it be digital innovations? Chances are it's probably both, and they enable each other in a number of respects. And so the lesson from history here is actually called the Engels pause, which was in the early and mid 19th century. So in the early part of the 19th century, you could see these inventions that Adam Smith had written about. So yes, factory output was increasing, but standards of living were not. There was a gap of about 30 years before average incomes and standard living actually began to shoot up. So it takes time to adapt, and it takes time to transition to a new set of drivers for the economy. So I'm very hopeful that we have actually seen quite a lot of investment in green industries and in the digital space. Could we be nearing the end of this Engels pause of the 21st century? In which case, after that, the increase in standards of living was exponential, and the latter part of the 19th century, brought great prosperity. So I do hope, that is the case. And actually, the best example is actually digital technology. So in the pandemic, how many people use Zoom, or how many people use Zoom now?
We're using it right now. Hi to everyone at home.
But Zoom IPO'd before the pandemic lockdown. So change is harder than you think. It was only when we are all locked down, then all of a sudden this technology, which had been there, changes the way in which we work. And that's why I'm also hoping that the same happens with green technologies. It's there, but for whatever reason, we just can't get ourselves to adopt it. So, so to me, the pandemic showed once it happens, look how quick it was. Literally within weeks. I was one of the first people to lecture using Zoom. And I remember I had like 5 IT people in my office, all trying to work out the buttons. And I was like, I think you just press join. I said, I'm pretty sure they can all hear me. And I was the only one with a Zoom account. It was like a special account at the time. But then the change is so quick. So I think, I just hope we can be optimistic that we have seen this in history before. We could be on the cusp of that again if we change our behavior. I think that's the lesson I'm trying to push out.
Thanks so much. It's almost like we need to have another, obviously COVID was so quick, it was an emergency. It's kind of the problem with the climate. It's gradually for us in the UK, at least, if you're in Bangladesh or, the Maldives, you're underwater and it's not so slowly. But, it's almost like we need to have we need something to hit us hard for us to realize it's a problem and shift our behavior.
Yeah, like cost of living crisis. I'm hoping that a good thing that comes from it is that it begins to change our use of energy, to go for more renewable energy. And I'm hoping that would, be the kind of jolt that the pandemic was. So should have invested in Zoom.
We all should have invested in Zoom. Anyway, hindsight. Do we have any other questions in the room? Yes, so we'll go for 1 and 2. Yes, go for it.
Thank you. Hello. Would you prefer a question on kind of green energy geopolitically or impending recession? Which one?
Dealer's choice, yeah.
Why don't we talk recession? So we've
Okay.
touched on green energy.
So apparently this recession is going to potentially be very different to any before. You've got a record amount of job openings at the moment. You've got a declining population. People are having less babies and less sex in general, apparently. But yet there is a record amount of job openings, but also like people are kind of going into careers like YouTube rather than engineering, creating like this huge job shortage in areas of the economy where it's needed. How do you kind of rectify that?
Yeah, no, it's a great observation. Not the bit about sex, the rest of it, which is so I think this is that phrase, "this time is different," completely ironic when people say that, because I prefer the Mark Twain quote, which is the unusual thing about this recession is how tight the labor market is. And there's a couple of explanations around it, which are actually quite worrying. So one of the reasons is because labor force participation rates for people over the age of 50 have fallen dramatically during the pandemic. And it's one of the reasons why output growth is slower in the UK versus other major economies. The thing about unemployment is that it's a lagging indicator. So firms hang on to workers, especially in a tight labor market, until they're sure they can't keep them. So generally, you see unemployment increase with a lag. So it's only when the economy goes into recession, we're actually in recession, then firms start to lay off workers, and then unemployment starts to rise. So the projections by the Bank of England are that we are entering into a 2-year recession, and unemployment will rise to over 6%, over the course of it. So I think the tightness essentially, might mean firms hang on for longer. And the other thing about the cost of living crisis, which is also why this recession is different, is that it's actually causing some of those older workers to return, the ones who can, because obviously some of them are out because they have long COVID or, other, issues. But because of the squeeze on, cost of living, some of them are actually thinking of coming back into the labor market. So I think every recession has these traits, but fiscal policy can shorten and make the recession more shallow. And so one of the lessons maybe we can draw from the 2001 recession is that quite unusually, and I'm thinking of the US, household wealth and income actually remained about constant. So unemployment rose, but it's a pretty shallow recession. And it was also a short recession. And we are in a completely different circumstance, but that idea of supporting demand came out really strongly. And by doing that, the dot-com bubble bursting, which was this massive financial crash, actually didn't generate, either a big, deep recession, or it was a very shallow recession and it was shorter. So that's what I'm hopeful about. The other reason why the labor market is so tight is because we've had the shift into more digital, online world, and there's a skills mismatch between current workers and the skills needed for that. So if you think about how governments can shorten this recession, they can invest in helping people reskill, which is actually very, very challenging, but absolutely worth doing. Traditionally, economists would say helping reskill existing workers is actually very hard. Because there's limited evidence that it's possible. But again, in this environment where you have more digital, the greater digital economy, it's probably possible. I was giving a book talk in Bristol the other week, and and a couple of guys in the audience raised their hands and said, we're retraining, we're learning coding, we're in our 50s. So this is not quite the same as being a farmer being asked to, sit in an office. It's a different kind of transition. So I'm always very hopeful. Actually, I'm probably in the wrong profession because I'm quite an optimistic person, and I somehow ended up in the dismal science. So thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, hands up if you had. Yes, okay, we'll go straight to the middle. Yes, thank you so much. Go for it.
Hi, thank you, Linda. Fascinating talk. I'm going to start with my question and then give some context. With the Theresa May, the mini budget, did everyone react too quickly? And the context I want to give is, you talk about demand being supported by the government, and her aim was to free up, to reduce taxes, to free up money to spend, either to invest or to spend in the private sector, sorry. And we're now looking at a situation where that's going to be constrained and that's going to move to the government, to the public sector. Does that not require a philosophy that the government is the best, or even a good allocator of capital? The reaction as well seems to be driven very much by markets. And one of investors' great adages or idioms is the markets can stay rational longer than I can stay solvent. And I've forgotten his name, your man with the rich sister-in-law at the very start. He was right, but he didn't have enough time to prove it. So, what's your view on how quickly that unraveled for Liz Truss and Kwasi?
Yeah, great point. The James Carville, who worked for President Clinton, the political strategist, after he served for a bit in the Clinton administration, he famously said, "I used to think I wanted to come back when I was reincarnated and be king, but I think I now just want to come back and be the bond market." And so I think what bond markets, do is that they need persuading. They need things to be priced in, and they need to be convinced that what you are saying is credible. So if you think about all the instances of bond market sell-offs, it's because either they didn't like the policy or they didn't believe it was credible. And I think the Liz Truss mini budget, they just didn't like, because as I explained a moment ago, I think it would have raised inflation. And so I think for one of my suggestions was that every country in the world right now has spent a huge amount on COVID, and therefore debt levels are very high. What you actually don't want to be is an outlier. You want to be in the middle of the pack, because everyone's in the same position. All advanced economies have debt to GDP ratios about 100%. Unfortunately, the mini budget of a few weeks ago, I was actually in Washington for the IMF World Bank annual meetings. And when I landed, everyone said, "Oh, the UK is the talk of the town." And I went, "Oh no, we need to be in the middle of the pack." And so what other countries are now looking at is how bond markets react to our autumn statement on Thursday, because we've been the subject of a sell-off. And so, so that ship has sailed. And also there was a joke that journalists were telling at the time that Kwasi Kwarteng found it hard to get a flight back because nobody wanted him near economy or business.
That's very good.
And then to the first part of your comment, which is around, I think the supporting demand, it makes the most sense to support those who are least well off and vulnerable for moral reasons. For Keynesian reasons is because they have a higher marginal propensity to consume. So whatever it is you give them tends to go back into the economy in a higher proportion. Rich people save more of what you give them. And so if you are wanting to support demand, you should do the right thing. And the right thing for people and for the economy is to support those who are going to struggle. And so I think that determination should be made, by the government. And in other areas, I don't think, the track record of government picking industrial winners is that great. But in this area, I've always been of the view that fiscal policy is a political choice. A government can choose how equal the society is. They can choose whether they want to become greener. So for instance, both France and Germany, their COVID rescue packages, 2/3 of them were geared at the greening the economy. Germany mandated electrical vehicle charging points at all petrol stations within the next few years. Every fiscal policy is a set of choices, and we should judge our government based on the choices that they make. Not because they can pick winners, but because they have a role in incentivizing, moving us towards a better growth path, a more sustainable one, a more equal one. And anyways, I think I said that once on a TV program and everyone just went, you're talking about the budget, right? But every set of choices, do you give tax credits for investment in factories? Why do you not give firms a tax credit for investing in people? Most services, businesses invest in people. Are you giving people development opportunities? Are you supporting them? Are you giving them digital infrastructure they could work from home? Why do we not give them incentives to invest in people? And so that's the kind of fiscal policy where the government can make a choice. And if we don't like that choice, we can vote them out of office. But I think being clear, that's what they're doing, would be very, very helpful. And that would tie into the second part of your question, which is that would help persuade bond markets. Bond markets were very focused on austerity, but they have, in the last few years, very focused on growth. They want to lend to countries that will grow because those countries are more likely to pay them back.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions? Yes, we'll come here and then here. Yes, that'll make things fairly simple, and then we'll wrap things up for the evening. So you can be our last two questions. Oh, no, we need you. Otherwise, no one at home everyone goes, what are they saying at home? So we need you to have the microphone.
Or be non-sequitur if I answer a question.
Yeah.
Like, what is she talking
Yeah, what is she talking about?
Thanks so much for sharing all of this with us. I think this question builds on some of the answers you just gave. I heard about an experiment last week where people are asked to design the society, assuming they haven't entered it yet. You talked a lot about equality. So I was wondering what some of the principles would be that you would design if you didn't know yet where you would enter the society.
Great question. So in my book, I write about John Rawls's A Theory of Justice and Paul Samuelson's application of that to economics and what he calls the ethical lens. So this concept is very much what the experiment that you just described is, which is, John Rawls, the veil of ignorance, essentially is if you stood behind a veil of ignorance and you were looking at a policy, so say it's, unemployment benefits or wind farms, and you didn't know if it would affect your neighborhood. You didn't know if you were the unemployed or if you were the taxpayer. If you applied that ethical lens, how would you judge that policy, not knowing your own position? And that's the premise of the veil of ignorance, and that's the premise of the ethical lens. So I would think that as you say, I'm very keen that we create an economy that is more equitable, is greener, and it grows in a way that improves people's standards of living. So you can grow the economy, but if you look at the US, the returns have gone to the owners of capital and not to people. So, why are wages so low? I'm glad we covered that off today. Those to me, so it's not about growing GDP, it's about growing GDP per capita and then the level of equality. And that is a political choice. So Canada and the US, are there any Canadians in the audience? Okay. So I'm originally American. And so I think I can say there's not a lot of difference between Americans and Canadians, However, on inequality, there is. America is much more unequal than its northern neighbor, Canada. And in fact, I remember working at a firm before where I found out the partner was having secret parties every weekend, and some of us were not invited. And it turned out he was Canadian and he had a Canadian posse. But, Canada has levels of inequality, which is similar to continental Europe. And so that's a choice. That's why I use that as the example in my book. So, so to me, fair, greener, and, really lifts people. I would hope those are the policies that take us into the 21st century. Well, there's a lot riding on Thursday.
We'll be on the edge of our seats for it. And we'll go for our final question. If you could make it quick, I'm very grateful because we need to make sure Dr. Linda Yueh gets home okay.
Okay, thank you for your talk today. I find it really interesting. I suppose I'm just interested in what you see as the future. We talked a lot about services and being a service economy. I'm interested in the future of financial services in this country, particularly the City of London, post-Brexit, a lot of them moving elsewhere in the EU or to the US or wherever, what you see as the future of that as our kind of the British USP was that we were very good at financial services, but has that changed?
Yeah, lovely short question. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One sentence or less.
I think one of the interesting, there's a lot of interesting things about looking at history, economic history. One of the fascinating things that I found is when the UK was overtaken by the United States as the economic superpower, the City of London remained a leading financial center, international financial center, unrivaled only by New York. And so even though the country was not growing as well, not as big and powerful as the United States, the deep expertise and long history here of having, a great legal system, great regulatory system, deep-rooted expertise, is why the financial sector, did so well. And then the banking crisis, I think, really raised a lot of questions around how well this sector is actually, and I think the repair job is from 10 years ago as a result of that. But I think the long institutional history tells you that you don't have to be an economic superpower to have a thriving, international financial center. It is about it is much more about how relevant the sector remains in a changing 21st century global economy. So, the UK is very good at services. We're the second biggest exporter of services after only the United States. We're actually the biggest exporter of financial services. So there's a lot of demand for what it is that the UK offers. And I'm going to finish with this thought. I know we're out of time, which is we haven't talked about it, but we live in an era of great power competition. The US suggests something, China says no, China suggests something, US says no. So it's good not to be an economic superpower right now. So if you are a non-economic superpower, then your financial center could do business that the Shanghai or New York may find challenging. And this applies for lots of things, but given your question, I would say, the future of being a services hub, the future of, being a country that, is not caught up in this great power competition, actually bodes very well, for the UK. And then finally, the UK is actually known for being very pragmatic. And that's a very strong trait, especially in this great power competition. And it's actually a lesson that other countries have learned from Britain. So I won't say who, but a very experienced diplomat said to me once, Britons are very good at being clever, but not showing it in the room. And the Singaporeans, apparently, they usually they've learned, but his story went, they used to walk into the room and the Singaporeans would just be the smartest people in the room and they would make sure that you knew it. And so nobody liked them, even though they were the best at what they did. But the Singaporeans apparently learned, and now they are much more agreeable and personable. And that's actually what Britain is very good at. There's a self-deprecation. That means you could be the smartest person in the room, yet people still want to work with you. So I'm not sure how we ended up on that note, but thank you. Very positive note to end on. Stay practical and position yourself well for the 21st century world.
Absolutely. I think that's a great note to end on. Can we please give Dr. Linda a huge round of applause? I do apologize for the flushing sounds behind us, but if you missed anything, you'll be sent the full recording in the next few days, so you can catch up. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure Dr. Linda will be happy to sign a few copies. They'll be available just over here at the back. And thank you so much for coming. We hope you have a lovely evening, and we'll see you at a Trouble event very soon.